Hello everyone, hope you all are doing great. This is Anna, your host for today's session. And on behalf of Team Sign Up Training, I welcome you all to today's webinar. Today we have Mr. Randy Duval with us, who is an experienced safety professional, emergency responder or instructor, and designated safety expert in OSHA and main safety regulated industries. With a global and multicultural sales training experience, he is also qualified safety sales provider and sales trainer.
Anna, thank you very much, and welcome to today's topic related to OSHA record keeping. So I've been in the safety business for a little over 40 years, and it seems like every time we hear about OSHA record keeping, we automatically default to the injury recording, reporting, tracking mechanism. And although that is a major significant part of the requirements, there are other things as well that OSHA requires us to track and maintain records. So we're going to start initially today by reviewing what the injury record keeping requirements are, but I want to expand that into more than just recording injuries and talk a little bit about what those other areas are where we are expected to maintain records. So this is not going to be an all-inclusive list, but it is certainly going to get you hopefully thinking about other venues that are required to be maintained and retained as records as it relates specifically to OSHA. So with that, our agenda for today, we're going to talk about the basics of OSHA record keeping, and then we're going to go a little bit beyond that 300 and 300A requirement, as in what else needs to be recorded and tracked. We're going to talk a little bit about documents that you must produce in the event that you do have an OSHA inspector arrive on your scene, as well as documents that are good to have, but not necessarily ones that you want to openly or publicly share with an inspector unless there is a valid reason for it. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then we'll just kind of wrap it up at the end. So if you have any questions, we'll save those questions for the conclusion, and happy to answer anything that you may have. So as we begin, as I stated earlier, that record keeping term really kind of causes us to default to an injury illness discussion. We have the Form 300, the 301, the 300A. We're in a period of time that just ended the requirement to post our 300A for people within our facility to be able to review if they want. That requirement is from February 1st to April the 30th. So I will say, if you still have yours posted legitimately, you have the ability to now take that down, put it in files. You got to maintain those for 5 years. But I really am a minimalist when it comes to regulatory requirements. I want to follow what the requirements say have to be followed. I do not want to exceed those requirements, because once we start going past what the law says we have to have, that's when we can potentially get ourselves in a little bit of conflict. And again, we will talk about that in a little bit later, a few slides from now. So we're going to take a look at what the 300 log is, which is literally a log of all of our injuries that are work-related in our workplace. So again, the key phrase there is work-related. If you have somebody that has a heart attack at work and it is not related to work, it is a personal illness or some other reason outside of work that causes that heart attack to occur, you would not put that on your 300 or put it on your 301. So again, work-related is the key phrase. 301 is an individual or personal information form, which literally most companies do not use the 301 anymore, because OSHA does allow us to use our worker comp first report of injury form instead. Otherwise, it would require duplication, and OSHA says we don't have to do that. So if you are if you do not have a first report of injury form for workers' comp that covers all of the requirements that need to be on a 301, then you have to complete a 301. But most worker comp first report forms have everything, the person's name, their address, their wage level, where they work, all of that is on that first report of injury claim form. And we no longer have to complete a 301 as a result of that. But remember that 301 is for each individual record. And if you have a software program, for example, that allows you to track your injuries and then produce a 300 and 300A at the end of the year, it probably also includes 301 fill-in as well. So that may happen automatically depending on your software package, but it does not require you to duplicate efforts if you're already doing a worker comp form. And then, of course, the 300A, we should all be familiar with. That's the one that we are now able to remove from the board, um, where we publicly post it at our location so that people can see how many injuries we actually had. But it is a summary. It does not include individual names. It does not include personal information that perhaps could be on a 300 or a 301. It's just a total summary that allows us to compare this year to what we did last year. So those are things that automatically are part of a record keeping discussion, if you will, related to injury and illness records. So in reporting to OSHA, this is going to be different than recording an injury. So we should know that difference already. But a reportable injury, one that requires us to actually contact OSHA within a certain period of time after a certain type of injury occurs, here they are. Anything that relates to a work-related fatality, if you are not sure initially if that fatality is related to a work event, then I would suggest you go ahead and contact OSHA because you're under the gun as far as timing goes, and that can be retracted once you determine that it is not work related. So don't fall into the trap that says, well, if we're going to consider it non-work related until we can demonstrate that it is work related. You might have to give them a call, let them know that it's occurred, and let them know that it's questionable, and they'll take it from there. You'll continue your investigation to determine whether it is or isn't. All work-related inpatient hospitalizations of one or more employees. So again, they have to be admitted to the hospital. This is not just taking somebody to an emergency department for evaluation or treatment, but they actually have to be inpatient. They have to be admitted to the hospital. If that occurs as a result of a work-related event, you have to contact OSHA. You have to physically report it to them. Any work-related amputation injury has to be reported. Any work-related loss of an eye has to be reported. And anytime that an individual actually suffers a level of unconsciousness, regardless of how long a period of time that is, we need to let them know. So employers must report work-related fatalities within 8 hours of finding out about it. Back in the day when I started, that 8-hour reporting requirement was held to pretty tightly because not all of us were considered to be um, reporters or news people or recording stuff on phones and putting it on social media or all that kind of stuff. It was a little bit slow getting that information out. So the 8-hour requirement was in the intensity of all that we needed to do if a fatality did occur, and control the scene and secure the scene and begin the investigation and deal with the family that might be the people of the person who was fatally injured, all of those things coming down on us, we still were required to ensure that we let OSHA know. These days, as fast as news gets out, they're probably already going to be aware of it before you call them. So you certainly want to make sure that you do call them within that 8-hour time frame, or they're going to be questioning what's going on. For any inpatient hospitalization, amputation, or eye loss, you have up to 24 hours in order to report the incident to OSHA. So again, a fatality must be reported within 8 hours. Any other type of reportable injury has to be done within 24. Only the fatalities that occur within a 30-day time frame of a work-related incident needs to be reported. So if a person is significantly injured and taken to the hospital for evaluation, they end up being in inpatient, they're admitted to that hospital, you have a reportable that requires contacting them within 24 hours. If because of those sustained injuries, that person does become fatally injured while still in the hospital, it then becomes a notification within 8 hours that you have to call OSHA and let them know that that has occurred. An OSHA recordable, on the other hand, does not require calling OSHA or contacting them. You don't have to get a hold of the district office. You don't have to call your local, friendly neighborhood so-called inspector. It's a recordable, and that's where your forms come in on the 300, the 301, and the 300A. So certainly a work-related fatality or anything else that is considered reportable will also be recordable. You've got to log it onto your injury logs as something that has occurred. But then there are other types of injuries as well that don't require calling OSHA, but do require recording the events so that should you have an OSHA inspector arrive at your scene for some particular reason, or even at the end of the year when you file electronically now your OSHA 300A. If they have any questions and they review it, they can contact you and get more information. But a work-related injury or illness, such as heat, stress, or hypothermia, something of that nature, requiring medical treatment that goes beyond first aid, meaning you can't handle it in-house yourself, but you have to take the individual to a medical professional to actually be treated. That is recordable. And we're going to talk a little bit about what's recordable versus what's a first aid. So I know sometimes there's confusion related to that. Well, when is it a recordable? When do I have to report it? What is or isn't first aid versus recordable? We'll talk about that in the next couple of minutes. A work-related diagnosed case of cancer or chronic irreversible disease. We hear all these things about asbestosis, silicosis, all those things where people have been exposed to certain types of chemicals or materials in the workplace, and as a result have developed what would be a work-related disease. They would have not gotten it any other way other than the exposure that they had at work over the years. Any type of fractured bones or teeth as a result of an injury, or if someone has punctured eardrums as a result of something at work, whether they get hit or whether it's a loud impact noise or something that punctures the eardrums. Those are work-related that have to be recorded. And then we have special recording requirements for any type of bloodborne pathogen issues with needle sticks and sharps, anything that's going to involve hearing loss, and tuberculosis. And I'm going to stop just for a moment on hearing loss because I really want to emphasize this point. Hearing loss is supposed to be recorded if it is a work-related hearing loss. You say, well, if we're at work, how do you know that it's not work-related? Well, I've been doing this for 40 years, and I have never, ever one time had to file a recorded threshold shift that was considered work-related on my OSHA log because of how we addressed hearing in the workplace. If you have a good hearing conservation plan, if you have sort of fleshed out or charted where with a either a dosimeter or a live sound meter, the types of noises and decibel levels that you have. You are ensuring that people are wearing the proper protective hearing equipment. You are ensuring that training is done on the use of that hearing protection, and you can verify perhaps you already now have administrative controls in place because you already know what the sound levels are, the decibel levels are, and you can rotate people around that have exposure to that noise level. You can actually demonstrate that they could not have suffered hearing loss as a result of a work-related exposure because of all of the um, um, protective measures that you are taking with those individuals. So if you are able to demonstrate that, you do not, that they're going to have to look elsewhere as a reason as to why there's a threshold shift. You can demonstrate that they did not get it at work. It could have been something that they do as a hobby outside of work, could be age related, could be a number of different things. But I would suggest that you keep track of all of your hearing protection levels, because it's real easy to shoot your incident rate totally to bits once you start doing your annual hearing tests, only to find out that out of 100 people, you've got 12 that suddenly are showing up with a hearing loss with a significant shift. And now you're in a position where you have to record all 12 of those as a recordable work-related illness. That is not good. It does not help your workers' comp rate. It does not help your employees because they're trusting you to make sure that you are helping them navigate through all this noise, that you're providing the right level of protection. And it's certainly going to call attention to your electronic report that you submit by February the 15th every year to OSHA now, where they can flag it and say, hey, there must be something serious going on here. Let's go do a special investigation and find out. You don't want to be in that position. So make sure, again, that you're able to track that accordingly. So what's a first aid? So we're talking about reportables as to when you have to contact OSHA directly. We talked a little bit about recordables that require medical treatment by a professional in order to treat the individual for that illness or injury. And so now what's a first aid? When do I not have to put it on my records or contact OSHA? So here's where you have a little bit of control over this scenario. So a non-prescription medication that is at a non-prescription strength can be considered first aid. So somebody bumps their head, has a headache, and they take 2 ibuprofen. It's non-prescription strength. It is a non-prescription medication. They decide to take the ibuprofen as a pain reliever. Maybe they'll take naproxen as a pain reliever and anti-inflammatory to get rid of that headache. But there's nothing more than a bump on the head that caused them to have a headache. That's a first aid. Now, a recommendation by a physician or other licensed healthcare professional, get this, to use non-prescription meds at prescription strength is considered medical treatment and has to be recorded as such. So in other words, you take somebody who's been injured for evaluation to your worker comp provider, and that worker comp provider says, okay, I'm not going to write you a prescription, but I need you to take 4 extra strength ibuprofen tablets twice a day in order for us to get this inflammation under control. Well, that 4 of extra strength ibuprofen is prescription strength. So if they tell you to do that, it is recordable, even though the medication itself is not a prescription drug. They're telling you to take something at a prescription strength level. Even if you just count out the 4 tablets out of the bottle, that requires recording it as a medical treatment, not as a first aid. Administering a tetanus or other type of immunizations. So somebody steps on something sharp and punctures their foot. You take them to your worker comp provider. They say, hey, this is pretty clean. It's not really going to have an issue, but we're going to give you a tetanus booster. The tetanus booster is not considered medical treatment. It's just a booster to prevent. It's a preventer, not a treatment. So that is something you would not have to record on your 300s. Any type of cleaning or flushing or soaking a surface of skin for wounds to make sure that they are not going to become infected are not considered medical treatment. Wound coverings such as bandages, gauze pads, those types of things. Somebody's got a little bit of a laceration, you grab a 4x4 gauze, put it over the top of it as a dressing, and then you secure that with a little bit of roll gauze or a triangular bandage to just hold it in place until it gets the ability to clot. Those are not considered anything more than first aid because you're able to control everything at that lower level. Using butterfly bandages or steri strips. So again, keep in mind, you got somebody that looks like they might actually need sutures because it looks pretty deep, but your worker comp provider is able to close the wound with a steri strip. A steri strip use does not constitute a recordable. It maintains a first aid level. However, if you have other types of wound closures, such as sutures or staples, it is medical treatment because it's not something that you can apply, and it's something that requires more internal fix than just a superficial or surface damage as a result of that injury. Using hot or cold therapy. So somebody twists their ankle, you put ice on it. You know, it's not recordable. Somebody strains a back muscle, and for the first few minutes you put ice on it, and then a couple hours after that you put heat on it to just kind of keep the muscles loosened up. That's a first aid. It is not a recordable. Using a non-rigid means of support like elastic bandages. So you got a weak ankle or a weak knee, you wrap it with an elastic bandage. That is not recordable. That's just a first aid. Now, if you do something that requires the use of a rigid or fixed splint or immobilizing device, now we're in the medical treatment side of things because the bone either has to be set or has to be positioned properly before that splint is put in play. So that's something from, if you take somebody to the emergency department or to your worker comp provider and they decide that that person has to leave with a rigid immobilizing device, we are in recordable range at that point, not just first aid. However, if you have to apply a splint as a precaution until you are able to get the person for that medical evaluation with the x-rays and further evaluation, that is not considered recordable simply because you are taking precautionary measures. It's only recordable if you determine that it's going to be longer lasting than just getting them for the evaluation. So all of that comes into play. Drilling a fingernail or toenail to relieve pressure is not considered recordable. Using eye patches are not recordable. Again, you're going to use the eye patch to get them to an evaluation stage. Remember also with eye patches, if you have to cover one eye with a patch and you're getting ready to transport them, you have to cover both eyes. We have what's called sympathetic movement. So if you have one eye that's been injured that's covered and you leave the good eye exposed so that people can watch where they're going while they're walking themselves to the truck or to the ambulance or to the stretcher, every time they move their good eye, their bad eye moves with it. So it's generally necessary to patch both eyes and then get them transported to where they need to be, so that they're not having excessive movement going on with their injured eye. Removing a foreign body from an eye that only requires flushing it with irrigation or with a cotton swab is first aid. It's not like a surgical removal of an embedded object. Um, removing splints, removing splinters or other foreign material, as long as you are able to just literally grab it and pull it out or swab it. It's not embedded, doesn't require recording it. Using finger guards, using some type of massage to get a muscle out of spasm mode or something of that nature, and then drinking fluids for relief of heat stress. None of those are considered recordables. They are first aid only. You have somebody in a heat stress mode like heat stroke, where they've gone unconscious, where they have sweat all of their electrolytes out of their system, and it requires IVs to get their fluid levels back up and their electrolytes back up. Now we are in recordable mode, but we are not for just heat cramps or heat exhaustion where we're just getting people to drink more fluid. So first aid summary, if it doesn't require professional treatment beyond evaluation. So here's another clarification. You take somebody for x-rays because you don't have x-ray vision and you're not sure how compounded the injury might be. The x-rays come back clean. They just say we've got a sprain. A person can wrap it with a elastic bandage, and next day they go back to work. That becomes an evaluation only and becomes first aid only. It does not become a recordable. It's only if they have to go beyond that. If treatment does not require prescription meds or non-prescription meds at prescription strength, and if a result does not require any type of restricted or modified duty or loss of time from work that starts after the day after the injury has occurred. So if somebody gets injured, you decide perhaps in your role that it's better to just send them home for the rest of the shift. They get a little bit of recovery time, but they're back to work the next day. That is not a lost time. The lost time starts when it is the shift after the injury occurs, in which they have to either not be at work or they are now on some type of restricted duty. So the day of injury does not constitute the count as a lost time or as a recordable. Needle sticks, that's another whole separate venue, but you get somebody stuck with a needle. How might that happen at work? Well, many of the places where I worked, we had people that were diabetic and actually had to do insulin shots at work because of the work schedules and length of hours that they had to work. So we had to provide a level of sharps removal so that when they did their insulin shot, they were able to get rid of that sharp, and they were able to do it in a safe manner. So there's always the potential you could get a needle stick, or perhaps even in a lab environment where you've got a bunch of glass, whether it's test tubes or beakers, and something breaks and now you're in the process of having to clean that up. Somebody gets a cut as a result of those shards of glass. So again, it's a sharp object that they had to pick up. That could potentially cause a bloodborne pathogen issue if the contamination of whatever was in uh, that beaker or test tube could be considered infectious. You must enter the case on the OSHA 300 log as an injury, and then just literally follow the requirements as it relates to bloodborne pathogens as to the steps that you need to take beyond that. So other considerations that we need to think about as far as record keeping is concerned. So a work relatedness evaluation, again, is not considered recordable. Working from home, there's a lot of that going on now because of all this COVID nonsense. Working from home or traveling on company business may or may not be a recordable injury. That's something that is going to require investigation, as all of your reported injuries should be. So working from home, if I'm working from home and I take a break and go out to my kitchen and I'm going to fix some lunch and I cut my finger with a knife that I'm slicing, meat or whatever to put on a sandwich, that is not considered a work related incident because what I am doing has nothing to do with the performance of my duties at work. Um, so again, you have to look at that. Traveling on company business. If somebody's in a hotel and slips in the shower and falls, is that a worker comp, work related, it's OSHA recordable incident or not? Depends on what state you're in, depends on what the situation is, going to require some investigation. It doesn't automatically imply that it is a recordable under OSHA or that it could be worker comp because they were out of town for work. Depends on what they were doing and was it in the course of their duties. All of that comes into play. Hearing loss, as we talked about earlier, may or may not also be work related. Depends on how well you have set up your hearing conservation program and what you have for being able to track those types of exposures. Medical surveillance programs are also going to be part of recording requirements. So anything related for exposure with lead or cadmium, formaldehyde, things that requires getting blood tests done, um, all of those types of things are going to require um, record keeping. It may not necessarily be on your OSHA 300. It may not be an illness, but it could be in that medical surveillance side of things that you have to keep records that you are doing that. Any aggravated pre-existing condition that requires new treatment. So as you know, we inherit, when we hire a new employee, we inherit whatever comes with them. And so they could very easily have a pre-existing condition, whether it's medical related that's personal, or perhaps it is a pre-existing condition from an injury that they may have had at another location. If it's something that gets aggravated or exacerbated in their work process that requires them to seek a new level of treatment, that will also be recordable. And then we have privacy concerns where you're able to check a box on the OSHA documents that say privacy concerns, and you don't have to provide the person's name or the body parts involved or the details of how perhaps that injury has occurred as far as the OSHA record keeping goes. So we talked a little bit about workers' comp as well as being recordable. So recording an injury or illness does not affect a person's entitlement to worker comp. That's a completely different animal. They are not interchangeable. If you were to have a recordable injury, it may or may not be a worker comp um, compensable claim. But that can differ from state to state. There is no such thing as a federal worker comp law. Every state has its own worker comp requirements, and whatever state you are in is what you have to be familiar with. If you are a multi-state corporation and you have responsibilities for multi-state locations, you have to be aware of what those different requirements are in each of those states so that you as an employer are following the same requirements and law that the employee is expected to follow, and you understand what can and cannot be done. Many cases will be recordable and compensable. So if somebody gets injured, uh, you may have to record it on an OSHA form. You may also have to pay for it under a worker comp where there's going to be compensable claims and benefits paid out. Some cases can be compensable but not recordable. We alluded to that earlier, where you take somebody to get evaluated and they take x-rays. Somebody's got to pay for those x-rays. It's not the employer that's going to pay for it. It's the not the employee that's going to pay for it, but the employer. So that's when you're going to engage your worker comp first report of injury and file a claim with your worker comp side of things. They're going to pay the physician. Some cases can be recordable, but won't necessarily be compensable. So if you were to have somebody that had a standard threshold shift for hearing and their audiogram, annual audiogram, and it's not within the speech frequency range, then you may have to record that as a shift, but it is not going to be, I'm sorry, yes, it is not going to be worker comp compensable because it's not work related and it's not in a speech level of loss that is going to impact the individual. So again, you'll have to take those and evaluate them case by case, but not always will you have a compensable claim if you have a recordable. Um, but generally, you will almost always have both. So injury and illness records are not the only thing you have to keep. So very briefly, let's talk about what those other things are. Many specific OSHA standards and other regulations outside of OSHA require um, maintenance and retention of records. Those are going to involve medical surveillance, exposure monitoring to whether it's chemical or noise or dust, workplace and equipment inspections. Generally, you are going to want to inspect your equipment and track it, whether it's for preventive maintenance purposes, whether it's to show for either ISO or VPP or some other type of award entity that you're going after, to show that you actually engage in those inspections and that you are performing them on a routine basis. Um, you're going to need records for those. Um, OSHA may want to see those records. This is where OSHA gets tied into it. If you were to have an injury related to that equipment, or you had some level of equipment failure that caused a problem, training records are also going to be part of that requirement. Other activities and incidents that are relevant to occupational safety and health. And there are also regulations that mandate reporting of certain types of information, such as standard threshold shifts. So it may not actually involve a medical reason, but there could certainly be other records that have to be maintained. Now, mandatory records for OSHA also include, whether it's by statute or regulation, that must be produced to OSHA on demand without a subpoena, meaning you have an inspector shows up for whether it's a random investigation, whether it's a complaint investigation, whether it's a fatality investigation, regardless of maybe you're a targeted industry that they're focusing on and they're going to ask for some stuff, you have to produce it. And we'll talk about what those mandatory things are in just a moment. Then you will also have non-mandatory records that are created by you that are normally for proactive type purposes. So if you are doing internal audits, for example, or conducting some level of inspection of equipment, you're going to track those, you're going to record those. You are not necessarily going to provide those to an inspector simply because he's on site. Those are non-mandatory. You do not have to produce them unless it is specifically related to an investigation that they are doing, and then they'll ask for it. So again, they can still be requested or produced with a subpoena for an investigation that they are doing, but they are to show proof of certain activities, which can be a defense for you. Or if you're not doing them, it can show that you identified, for example, a known hazard, a recognized hazard, and then 3 months from now, you still haven't corrected it. You know that it's a hazard, and now somebody's been injured from it. Well, that's going to be used against you, the same as conducting those inspections and identifying those hazards and documenting that you have corrected in a timely manner those hazards will work for you in showing your good faith in wanting to maintain a safe workplace environment. Um, Employee policies and handbooks are there for your benefit, not for OSHA. Near miss or near hit reports, disciplinary reports, doing a job safety analysis. Now, this is not the same as doing your risk assessment to determine when PPE is required to be used, but just JSAs or other type of operating procedures that help people do their job safely. That's a proactive way of being able to help someone, but they are not mandatory. They are not required by some statute or regulation. But any of those can be subpoenaed or used, either called out by OSHA or used by you, that you would present to OSHA as a defense mechanism. So don't anticipate that just because you have something labeled as non-mandatory that it'll never be seen outside of your eyes. That is not necessarily true. And the whole purpose of documenting all that is to make sure that you can show good faith in what you are doing and maintaining safety with your employees. So what has to be mandatory? Mandatory documents for OSHA are any of the written programs that are in the standard. So you have to have a HAZCOM written plan, process safety management if you're dealing with ammonia, respiratory protection, confined space, lockout, tagout, bloodborne, hazard assessments, hearing conservation, training records for first aid, industrial trucks and cranes, has WAPR if you have any of those activities taking place, and any type of medical surveillance and exposure monitoring that must be done because of whatever funk your employees may be getting exposed to, that the standard says you have to maintain some level of surveillance as a result of that exposure. All of those are mandatory documents. The inspector does not have to have a subpoena. They can ask for them anytime they want when they show up on the property. It can or cannot be directly related to their investigation, but they have a right to see them. Non-mandatory examples are sampling results. So if you've got your sound meter out there and you're doing your mapping, if you will, of your facility, of where your noise levels are, where the decibel levels are the worst, where you need to incorporate some type of administrative control as well as PPE, those sampling records are non-mandatory. Audit records, calibration records. Now, calibration records might be required to be produced if you're doing ISO 45001, or if you're doing VPP requirements, you may have to present those, but those are voluntary programs. They are not mandated regulatory programs. Any type of consultant or supervisor log or notes that might take place if you bring somebody like me in to do a review of your injuries or your incident rates or your lockout tagout program or whatever. That consultant is going to need to take notes and track some things that they are doing on your behalf. They are non-mandatory records. Training records and syllabi do not have to be produced as mandatory records unless it is specifically around cranes, industrial forklifts, um, purchase orders. So you're buying some new safety equipment. Nobody needs to look at those. Nobody cares. That's an internal thing that you're dealing with. So you should always consult with your legal counsel if an inspector or somebody up the OSHA chain requests certain documents, because a lot of times an inspector will ask you for them as a means of gaining access to them. It's not illegal for them to ask for them, but you do not have to produce them. So if you do not know that and you just open the file cabinet drawer and turn everything over to them, it's Christmas for them. So you may want to check with your legal counsel as to when documents get requested, as to whether you actually have to produce them or not, or if it's going to turn into a court case where you have to maintain and retain them, where you're not able to get rid of them. Just very quickly, I would also say, regardless of what you are maintaining for records, retention policies need to be in place. You need to ensure that if there is a federal requirement or a state requirement for how long you need to keep a record, that you note that on your retention policy. Otherwise, when you have other, documents that are proactive for you that you're hanging on to, those are not things you want to hang on to for life. You want to have a retention process and a destruction process that you follow. Even on the requirements, if you have training records that have to be kept for 5 years, at 5 years and 1 day, you better be shredding those bad boys. So you always want to make sure that you are within your record retention policy, but that once once those records exceed those retention mandates, you should be getting rid of them, not hanging on to them. They can come back and haunt you if you hang on to them, because once one gets out, they're all accessible and available. There's criminal penalties associated with not following the requirements. And we already suggested here, having mandatory record retention requirements for all documents should be followed, including your destruction schedules. Once you anticipate some level of litigation, meaning your employee has hired an attorney and they are now reaching out to you for documents, you must realize that those documents now have to be preserved. You can't now follow that retention record for those specific types of documents that are being requested. They have to be maintained. So again, if you've already followed your retention standard and you've gotten rid of them within that retention time frame, somebody can't come back later on and request all of them. So OSHA requires employers to keep records for multiple categories and for multiple purposes. Mandatory documents are established by statute, as well as within the standards, and must be produced when requested by an OSHA inspector or investigator. So you're going to have 1904 requirements, you're going to have 1910 or 1926 requirements, depending on whether you're general industry or construction. There'll be some other things in there as well within the OSHA standard where they're going to require you to maintain some level of documentation. Non-mandatory documents are useful for in-house as employer-generated documents to help manage and control programs and activities and tracking. So one of those things that we did for a number of years, we had what was called a hazard recognition tracker. And we would approach our employees on a regular basis and say, hey, you guys are the face-to-face of these work-related requirements. What are you able to identify as a hazard? Let's track it, let's record it, let's follow up on it, let's fix it, and let's date how long it takes for us to do it. That's an internal document that allows your employees to know that you are taking seriously the requirement to eliminate a recognized hazard, that you are putting action to it, that you are, whether it requires engineering controls or then administrative controls, or maybe just reevaluating the PPE that's in use for that particular hazard. They are recognizing that, first of all, they're part of the identification process. They are part of the elimination or reduction of hazard exposure to that process. And they recognize that you are valuing their feedback and their input. And that goes a long way for keeping your employees engaged, as well as maintaining good morale with people knowing that you do care about their personal safety and health and that you act upon it. If you're in one of those environments where you have an employee that brings a problem to you as a recognized hazard, and the best you can do is, well, we don't have the money for that, and it goes on year after year after year, you got employees that are going to be at a point where they just don't give a flying leap rip about what they provide you with or don't provide you with. And you got lawsuits waiting to happen. You got injuries waiting to happen. You got morale that's going to suck because the employees are going to just assume that you have no interest in their safety at all. So there's a lot of things that you can do, just little incremental step-by-step things that keeps your employees engaged and keeps them in good humor, if you will, to ensure that you maintain a safe work environment. All documents that you produce can be subject to investigation by an inspector or by an investigator, or perhaps by you as a means of defense. So if somebody gets injured and you are able to demonstrate that you trained the individual, you have training records that show that they have been trained, you have periodic evaluations of job performance that shows that they are doing the job correctly, and then suddenly one day they decide to go rogue, those records can help you as an employer to either reduce or not have a citation written against your record, which, as you know, becomes public record. Once you get a citation, it goes public on OSHA's website where everybody in the world can access it and see what's happened. So going back to making sure that you have your OSHA injury forms, your 300, your 301, and your 300A, making sure that you are posting that 300A from February 1 to April 30, making sure that you are engaged in other record keeping requirements, as we've already mentioned here in this webinar, will ensure that you are ready should an inspector show up. Now for 2022, there are some additional things that are taking place, and I want to just call them to your attention real quick as we have time here. As you know, OSHA in late 2021 is in the process of proposing a heat stress related standard that you are going to have to follow. In that process, they are also targeting specific industries on a national emphasis program, which, as you know, is supposed to be for a limited amount of time. There are NEPs out there that have been going on for 10 years. So once they put it in place, it's not likely they're going to remove it. So you need to be prepared for addressing those type of heat-related issues. And they also, once the temperature within a certain environment gets to be 80 degrees or higher, they are proposing that they will have targeted inspections in those targeted industries that they can do simply because the temperature has warmed up, and it allows them to determine whether or not you are protecting your employees properly. So those things are coming up. Another thing that is being proposed is COVID-19 tracking supposedly as a workplace illness. That's kind of bogus. We don't track colds, we don't track flus, but for some political reason, we're now saying that if you have COVID-19 and you're at work, that somehow you caught it at work and it has to be recorded on your OSHA logs. Stand by for that, because courts will usually throw that one out, but it is coming. So make sure that you are paying attention to those particular areas and that you are proactive in making sure that your employees are properly protected. If it's a heat stress environment, you should be doing that already. You shouldn't need a standard or regulatory action to put you into a position where you're going to protect your employees and care for your employees. You should be doing that already. But those are some things that are coming down the pike that are going to add to your record keeping requirements. So that said, I want to go ahead and stop here. And Anna, if you are here, I want to go ahead and open up for questions for anybody that might have one.
Okay, thank you, Randy, for this wonderful presentation.